Pheko, we are ready to start when you are.
Deep breath, ready to roll. Good afternoon to all of us. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good day, and good feminist greetings. We are happy to welcome you to the second panel of the South Feminist Futures Festival, the inaugural one. And the title of this session is on Bandung and Southern Feminism. I would like to appreciate the previous session, which I think led us very ably into an excellent remembrance of women's health, especially for Black and Brown women, and the traumas that we face, particularly as Black and Brown people across the world. The fact that our bodies are not just places of war zones, but also places of healing, places of rest, and places of great inspiration, places of great thought, and places of great creativity. And I invite us, even as we are talking very seriously about very serious things, to continue to nurture ourselves and to nurture each other. I'd also like to appreciate all of the people who have taken time out of their schedules to join us, especially at the end of the year. And at a time when most of us are running on fumes, we have committed to hanging there a bit longer and join us for this wonderful festival of love and of hope, really. And I think lastly, I'd also like to appreciate all of the organizing committee, and they each know who they are. I don't want to be undemocratic and name people and risk omitting other names, but I'd really like to appreciate all of the energies that have gone into this and the people who have brought their financial resources, their imagination resources, their creative resources, their linguistic resources, including the interpreters here, their IT resources like Stractivate and others, and their various talents. We are incredibly appreciative of you. I'd like to open with a quick poem, if I may, because I find that these things have a way of setting a tone and lifting our energy. And this is called Whirlwinds. Whirlwinds nearly always are born beneath a tree at the hour when the sun has reached its zenith. In a column of burning dust, they climb straight into the sky, scouring everything in their way. Old secos and mats, calabashes with holes, empty gourds torn away, fly in spurts, bumping into hedges, uprooted, flapping roofs. Sometimes a fire starts and panic grips the village. Women and children beat on boxes, anything that falls beneath their hands, thinking to banish the evil spirit with their racket. But we stand, we stand, we stand through every whirlwind. And on that note, I would like to introduce, without further ado, our wonderful speakers. We're very privileged to have, firstly, really what I call a feminist elder and one of our living ancestors, Professor Devaki Jain. I have been following her work. I've been a bit of a groupie for a long time, for about 20, 25 years in the realms of feminist economics. She is an alumnus of St. Anne's College, Oxford. She was elected as the honorary fellow of the college in 2016. And she was also a lecturer in economics at Delhi University from 1960 to 1969. Can we please mute? Over the course of her career, she founded a range of institutions, such as the very well-regarded Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era Dawn, from which many of us have found a lot of sustenance over the years. And she's also was the founder and director of the Institute of Social Studies Trust. She's also been a visiting fellow at Harvard University, Boston, University of Sussex, to name but a few. And she also has an honorary doctorate from right here in South Africa, from the University of Westville, Durban, South Africa. She was also part of the State Planning Committee of Karataka, and also the erstwhile South Commission, which was established in 1987 and chaired by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. She has been an advisor for the UNDP. She's been part of the Eminent Persons Group associated with Graça Machel Committee on the Impact of Armed Conflict. Devaki Jain, it is a pleasure to welcome you. Also part of this panel is another wonderful thinker and a big sister, I guess, to me and many other people in this space, Dr. Mariama Williams. She is one of the founders of the International Gender and Trade Network, which is where I first met her. For the past few years, she's also been at the South Center, running a program there on sustainable development, climate change, and gender. She is a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network and a board director of the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica. Her areas of interest include women in economics and the economy and sustainable development issues, including international trade, finance, debt, South-South cooperation, and social development. She's also one of the leading lights in thinking around issues of gender and trade, gender and climate finance, women's leadership, social sustainability, and women's economic empowerment. And it is absolutely a privilege and a pleasure to welcome both of you into this session. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you in turn to say a bit around the theme of this topic. So I guess one of the things that we were thinking about was the notion of Bandung as and the way it represents anti-colonial histories and histories as well. It contributed greatly to African and Asian freedom movements, and it's situated within anti-colonialist movements. I think what we're hoping to draw on here, especially during these very difficult and fragile times, is how we can resuscitate South-South solidarity, how we can go beyond very narrow constructions of how states are conceived of, particularly in the era of Corona, which is yet again another crisis of capitalism, another example of the ways in which market orthodoxy has failed, and go beyond the ways in which perhaps we can loop back and think around the manifestation of global power relations, international trade, farmer colonialism, for example, labor and migration patterns, patriarchal states, and so on. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to make interlinkages in this session around oppression and the intersectional approach to social political liberation and the different streams of African, Asian, and African and Arab feminisms, which were part of the intersectional approach, which actually underpinned the Bandung project. And then contemporize this by exploring and exposing some of the language traps of institutions such as the IMF and the WTO, the World Bank, the G77, and so on. Is the non-aligned movement even still viable, for example? So I'd like to hand it over to each of you to speak. I'll start with you, Devaki Jain, to speak for about 15 minutes and perhaps share some reflections, perhaps even a historical context of where Bandung, the origins of feminist economics and feminist ideology and anti-imperialism from the Bandung project, and perhaps how we can link that back to the current context before turning the conversation also to you, Mariama. Thank you.
Okay.
Professor Jain? You're still on mute.
Yeah,
perfect. Go ahead.
There you are. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful occasion. And I can't tell you how thrilling it is for me at this age to feel that feminists in Africa are reviving so much of the political ethos and aspirations of an era in which I was a young woman like you are. So thanks a great deal. So for me, I've called my presentation or my sharing reflections on Bandung and beyond.
You can't share.
What's the matter?
You can't share the presentation.
Host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay. So not only it's the most memorable moment for me, not only to be with my comrades in the African feminist movement, but to be talking about the revitalization of women of feminist-led South-South bonding with the special re-invocation of the non-aligned movement. While the statement from the organizers had the wisdom to dissociate themselves from that particular event and process of 1955, but to use that idea for a rebirthing of friendship and bonding between the former colonies is a brilliant move from feminists. And I really want to congratulate all of you for thinking of it. And for me, it has a very special meaning, and I'll tell you why. Because there's a personal story here, and then I would like to present my own thoughts later. The personal story is that a man that I married, called Lakshmi Jain, who is no more alas, was a student in 1947 and was one of the young volunteers that were recruited by those who organized the Bandung Conference. Can you imagine that? You may not have heard the name of a woman called Sarojini Naidu, who was very active in the freedom struggle. Sorry, yeah. And then partnered with men who founded the first Bandung Conference. It's not moving. So my husband was an assistant for the conference, and he's written about the experience of being in the Bandung Conference. And I want to tell you, this is the book that he wrote, which I must show you. And one of the stories he mentioned, which I thought would be interesting for you to know, is how they brought Sukarno from Indonesia without the Dutch government knowing about it. So one of our political leaders, who was also a pilot, flew into Indonesia that night and stealthily picked up Sukarno and brought him to the conference. These unconventional moments captured the spirit of the conference, but had nothing near what we have set out to do. We believe now in ourselves, namely feminist thought, feminist struggles, feminist way of understanding freedom, and feminist ways of sharing that freedom. But yet, since I was married to a man that witnessed the first Bandung Conference, it's particularly thrilling for me, and I want to spend a few minutes describing it from his description. They say the delegates gave the Indonesian delegate a standing ovation when he entered. Such was the bonding and the thrill of the leaders of that struggle. And there were people from East Asia, Egypt, and there were other tensions of discomfort, like Palestinians at the presence of Israel. You can read all about that in his book called Civil Disobedience, which, alas, is not available in Africa. But a paper he wrote on Bandung is available, and I'll share it with Nancy Kachingwe. As many of you may know, I'm not able to move this. Sorry. Why is it not going when I try? It's not going.
Use 2 fingers.
No, it's not going. Some of this, namely the effort to bring South-South feminist intellectual bonding, reaffirmation of identities allied with criticism of the given parable, was tried when I initiated the process through which DAWN, Development Alternative with Women for a New Era, was called. It was mistakenly called a Third World Women's Network. I hate the designation Third World, just as I abhorred rejecting the term underdeveloped. These were the traps into which we walked in. But where this initiative taken by all of you here surpasses anything that we have ever done, it is more affirmative of the identity, political, social, and historical of our peoples. So my salams to all of you. And for me, this is like a gift, a tonic as I reach what looks like the last years of my life. As you know, I'm now 87 years old, and it's quite remarkable that I'm able to talk and think. And you probably know that I can even walk. This is quite extraordinary, and I cherish this gift that I've been given by my parents of longevity and good health, and my mind has not yet collapsed. That has given me the opportunity to listen to you today and to be able to celebrate what you're doing and to feel a sense of peace that my mission will continue. Thank you again for inviting me, and to Hope Chigudu, who always thinks of me. Having said that, let me share with you some of the thoughts that are in my mind on reclaiming South-South internationalism. One of my pet themes is the overthrowing of the colonial cloak or gown that has been thrown over us, not only at the time politically, but permanently, intellectually, by vocabulary. The naming of things, and let me straightaway give you an example. One of the most pernicious names that is still stuck with us is dividing labor into formal and informal labor. Informal labor is a name given to labor that is not part of a proper wage structure and labor ministry laws. They are those who work either as self-employed vendors or those who are recruited by contractors for a particular job. In other words, they have no formal, relationship, legal binding with whatever employers, so they are called informal. In India, for example, 97% of labor is in this compartment. It is our argument that as feminists in India, that such labor is not informal at all. These workers are bound in the most formal, cruel ways. There is no wage fixation, there's often linkages with debt, and there's abuse of their availability across the board. So we would like to call them not informal sector, but the first sector. This idea came from another great feminist, Srilata Batliwala. Why do we call it the first sector? It is our belief that this primary characteristic of labor in our countries, Africa, South Asia, the first sector, this is the sector which generates everything, production, services, life, livelihood. So we call it the first sector, not informal, and we call them workers. I have many more examples of how to transform them. In fact, I've written a whole paper on the imperialism of vocabulary. Take this chart that I'm showing you. Home, I feel, can be called workplace because many of us in our countries work from home and produce at home. So home is workplace. Informal sector should be renamed as the first sector. This is where the largest number of laborers are conglomerated. Subsistence is not a good word. Self-reliance is a better word. We are self-reliant, try it as much as we can with whatever we have. Seclusion should be renamed female socialization. The seclusion idea has been used badly against those who have Muslims and others who are in some kind of asset. So call it female socialization, which is what Fatima Mardise also supported. Decentralization, we call it localization. You see how different, when you change vocabulary, you straight away and give it a new meaning, you straight away empower it. Home-based work could be called household enterprise. So this transformatory language, I think is a very important change that I was trying to make. Sorry, can you change this for me? I'm not so good on this technology, so I'll use what I'm. So home as workplace would make our women who produce at home workers. And so you can reinterpret all those terms. The terms acquire a new power. What would a feminist Bandung look like? I asked myself. Could it start at the bottom rather than top? Could it start with women workers who are called informal, but we know that we mean by those workers? They are self-employed, not organized, often home-based. Could those women meet for a repeat of Bandung? We go, an informal employment association of women workers, has given birth to something called HomeNet, International Gathering of Home-Based Workers. But while these global networks have provided enablement to women as workers, they have not challenged the macroeconomic theories and the politics that comes out of it. What seems possible in the initiative you have taken is that it is politics, and of course, politics presumes power. So it is something to look forward to. Could this initiative move towards a new agenda which lays down a new theory of macroeconomics? Now I come to my dream, and Mariama knows about this. My dream has always been that we have to challenge the economic theories that are prevalent, whatever it is. They are trickled down, generate growth, generate surplus, redistribute. Another growth is possible. Mariama knows my ideas on that, and the South Commission Bulletin printed my paper. I called it the bubbling up theory of growth instead of the trickle down theory of growth. The bubbling up theory argues that the process of removal of poverty can itself be an engine of growth, that the incomes and capabilities of those who are currently poor have the potential to generate demand, which in turn will power production, but of goods that are immediately needed by the poor, that are currently peripheral in production. The oiling then of this engine will bubble up and fire the economy in a much more broad-based manner. Unlike export-led growth, it will not skew production and trade into the elite trap, which is accentuating disparities and creating discontent. These ideas are not fragmented to deal with specifics, but are founded in an overall approach on what is economic and political progress, enshrining individual rights and sovereignty, but ensures that the basics, food, clothing, shelter, and the right for self-determination are the center. Their measures of success are not the rate of growth of GDP or the value of trade, but the spread of well-being. So here I go adding one more item to an agenda for transformation, a bubbling up theory of growth. I hope we have said enough for us to have a discussion. And I thank you very much again for bringing me out of the cave and letting me share the new initiative on reinventing the old Bandung. Thank you.
Thank you, Devaki. As opposed to bringing you out of the cave, perhaps we should all join you inside the cave, because there's clearly some creative magic that's taking place inside there. I'm particularly struck by the reconfiguration and the reinvention of language. I have people who know me, and my friends and sister colleagues who know me know that I have a bee in my bonnet about the informalization of the formal, and that language matters and that vocabulary matters. So that's deeply resonant, and that we keep informalizing things that are regular, that are dependable, that happen all the time because they must happen. And we also relegate to housework or chores, things that actually enable market economies to function. And as you say, everything, this first sector generates everything, life, livelihood, income, it generates everything. So I would love to get a hold of this paper, The Imperialism of Vocabulary. And I think it stands as a very powerful canon to our own vocabulary as well. I think I'd like to also hand back to Mariama to also come in, and then we can combine the Q&A if that's okay with both of you. And Mariama, take it away, sister.
So good afternoon, everyone. I thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to see you, Devaki. You're looking so wonderful and bright. And I just 87. I'm like, no, she's not 87. She made a mistake calculating. But I really want to start by really acknowledging the power of this concept of the imperialism of language, and that we need to really transform that and not consistently keep repeating it. But I want to thank Nancy and Liepollo for this, and the team that has conceptualized and implemented the South Feminist Futures Festival 2020, because I think it's a really dynamic name and it's really great and it's very wonderful. And thank you so much for involving my participation in it. I wanted to do a couple of things. One is I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened at Bandung in terms of from an historical ideological construct and the interpretive significance of that period, and where we, relative to where we are now, right? In terms of the objectives and the goals and the communique that came out of that. And which I think is really important that we recognize that, because there's a sense in which many of young feminists today might think that feminism or feminisms is coming from a linear European construct. And it's important in trying to prepare for this that even I've learned that, you know, even before Bandung, there was international feminist movement, and there were international feminist conference in 1948. That brought together primarily Asian and some African countries. That was before, and they met in Beijing in one of the first conference that the communist regime then had. And we've had these different waves of feminisms in our colonial context, those who were the reformists trying to make colonialism legitimate, and those who were more of the leftist persuasion, trying to articulate about colonialism and the imperialism, and also looking at where women were and so forth. So this is a very long tradition that is part of our history, our precursors that we need to carry forward as African women, Caribbean women, Asian women, women from the Pacific, as part of the South-South futures, right? To build on that and to lift up where we can. And the language also that they articulate, some of which may need to be modernized, but definitely bedrock ourselves so that we're not perpetuating and evolving a Western practice, that we have our own dynamic practices within our own communities at community level, not recognized because of the European mindset about what it is in terms of state, market, and household. And that might be one of the constructs that we have to devolve, you know, this idea that there is a state, there's a market, and then there's a household. Because the householders is the fundamental relationship as individuals or groups of individuals that creates a possibility for the creation of the nation state and for the creation of the market, corporates, and so forth. So I think we need to ground ourselves into that. It's really important that we kind of reconceptualize and recontextualize the significance of that conference and its policy implication for now. And I'm drawing on a paper which is really great that I found, written by a Tukumbi Lumumba Kasango in the Bandung Journal of the Global South, which is really interesting for really giving us a proper historical lens of what happened there. And I don't have time to go into the history, but I think it's warrant some of us to look at that, because there was over 2,000 people at that time that met in Bandung, right? Journalists, observers, and many of the statespeople who we look at today, and including Indira Gandhi, who later became prime minister. She came with her father. Devaki and others may know more about the women who attended that meeting. I haven't seen much about that. I've seen a lot of discussion about the All Indian Women Congress and the meeting prior to and subsequent meetings which I'll come to. What's important for us, for me anyway, in looking back at this history and drawing out some parallel, is that the conference, of course, condemned racism in South Africa and what had happened there, but they articulated a vision of a global anti-imperialist cooperation that would occur among them and beyond their borders. And that, the principle and those that I would think we need to focus a lot, decolonization. If we look at the Black Lives Matter and the global issue of indigenous people reclaiming their heritage, ethnic group reclaiming their assets and so forth, that is part of that decolonization. Political self-determination. To what extent do we really have political determination when our macro policies and we're indebted and we have investor states that sue governments? All of those things are part of that, right? Equality was a principle that came out of that. But was that equality? It's equality among nation states. It didn't necessarily speak to equality among men and women. It also referenced equality among all peoples independent of their race and social status, but gender wasn't one of the founding principles. And that's something we need to, as we move forward with this feminist Bandung, is that we're uploading that. So the goal was to promote economic and cultural cooperation. They talk about protection of human rights. To what extent are our governments following that? Many of us, the governments have pulled back from human rights. So that was one of the founding principles of the Bandung meeting. And the call to end racial discrimination wherever it ends. Those are really good things, and it's part of what we are talking about when we talk about multiracialism, we talk about BIPOC people, we talk about looking at what is going on in the world today. So I think some of these principles and goals of Bandung can inform us, and we can begin to look at it to see to what extent we have decolonization. And here I want to read a quote, which I thought was very relevant to our discussion today. So I'm getting today. It says, "We're often told colonialism is dead. Let us not be deceived or even soothed by that. I say to you, colonialism is not yet dead. How can we say it is dead so long as vast areas of Asia and Africa at that point were unfree? Today we could say they're under global value chains. They're under IMF, World Bank tutelage. They're under various WTO restrictions. And I beg of you, do not think of colonialism only in the classic form of which we who are here at this conference are. Colonialism has its modern dress in the forms of economic control, intellectual control, physical control by a small but alien community within different nations, and we know where that means, and that's also referenced in indigenous people in my reinterpretation of this quote. It is skillful and determined enemy, and it appears in many guises. It does not give up its loot easily, wherever, whenever, however it appears. Colonialism is an evil thing, and one which must be eradicated from the earth." And that was from the opening speech given by President Sukarno of Indonesia. That speech could be said by a Black Lives Matter activist today. It could be said by an indigenous people today. It could be said by a radical feminist in any of our countries today. So there were some things that were there: race and decolonization. So many countries around the world now, we need to look at what do we mean by equality and self-determination, and how is that matching our economic policies, the way we frame our economy, where we're growing our economy. So Bandung and the spirit of Bandung, which gave rise to many things later on, the South-South Cooperation, even the South Center, which came out of the South Commission. It gave rise to the G77 of 136 countries. So that's a very primal meeting. And I think our meeting today could and has the potential to be a primal meeting, the spirit of which will have echoes and strong credence and concrete realities impacting the lives of women and children and men everywhere. So since Bandung, we've had structural adjustment, the Washington Consensus, we had the WTO, we have all of those various things. But most importantly, we still see issues of the colonialism and decolonization in terms of the strong presence of extractive industries in Africa, and they're returning in the Caribbean. So Guyana, which is in the Caribbean now, have oil, has made a hopefully awfully bad contractual relationship with the major oil companies in 2020, okay? These are our leaders in 2020, after all of the work on extractivism, on destructivism, and also all of the things that are mattering to us about climate. They are still our governments, many of our governments are still making these deals with international capital. So we have a lot of work to do around this. So where do we go? Right? And I want to go back again to Sukarno because I thought that speech was good and it serves us today. He said, our task is first to seek an understanding of each other. And out of that understanding will come a greater appreciation of each other. And out of that appreciation will come collective action. And that's what I think we're here this week to do, to share our regional specificity, but not to dwell there, to share it so we could learn from it, to pool together, and to really look at what it is that we need, what are the structures, the ideology, the conceptual, the frameworks that we need to challenge, what are the scope in each region for us to continue to work to build these global and regional and national processes, to forgo ideology and the geopolitics, but to really look at how do we remap the world from, I think as Devaki and you both have said, from the perspective of the people who are the base of our communities, the base of our economies, right? And part of that is reclassifying, putting up systems of measurement to show their importance. I think one of the things that is happening now is that the COVID, Devaki, more than anything else, is showing that the home place is the workplace, right? So we are back to situating production in the home. Now that has advantages and disadvantages, but at least there's a sense in which people begin to realize that. So we've gone through a period where we were able to segment work from home, and we went to factories, and now we're in these high-rise buildings with our computers and so forth. And we think we're all that, as the young people will say. And a small, tiny microbe, right, has brought some of the most richest countries to their knees. And it's reconceptualizing what we think of as work, who is important in this grand scheme of how we live our life, who sustains us, right? Black people, people of color, Indian people, Mexican Americans, people in Europe who are doing the domestic work, people all over the world who are in what Devaki is so-called the first sector. You know? In Jamaica, we've long stopped talking about informal work, even though our statistician who report to the World Bank and so forth still have those categorizations. But a lot of our literature talk about own account producers. They're producing on their own, right? And they're, one of the things that I think COVID has shown, certainly in the Caribbean and maybe also in Africa and South Africa, is the extent to which the collaboration and cooperation of poor people in communities are the survival mechanisms. Because despite the government initially putting up money for COVID stimulus, Most of our people are not in the labor market. They don't have access to Social Security and all of those things. And it's that community living and sharing inside communities that is keeping people surviving. When jobs have disappeared, even the little jobs that they would have in small stores have disappeared. It's the sharing and the gifting, what Peggy Anthropos would call the gift economy, right? Is what's sustaining us, right? People are sharing, people are helping each other in community. And that's when the formal economy, quote, formal economy, fail to protect us. It's people linking arms, doing work, saving each other, bringing each other water, food, supporting each other. It's our natural medicines that many of us still have access to, if we have access to, that we're relying on in many ways to carry us through. I know that in the case of Jamaica, when we had the outbreak of chikungunya, and people couldn't afford to pay for pharmaceuticals, they were going to their yards and they were picking leaves from soursop trees and leaves from various plants and utilizing it, some of it quite effectively, that are now being studied. And I'm sure the pharmaceuticals will be gobbling these up and intellectually protecting them and making them into compounds and medicine. And I think it's the same dynamics we see, that our economy fundamentally depends on the human labor of men and women at all levels of the society, providing that base, that security. And all of the economies, whether in Europe or the US, depends on labor of people of color to survive. So wherever you look, that trajectory from where we were, from Africa to now, is what's still sustaining and carrying forward European, American, Australian economy. It's that blood, it's the sweat and blood of our people. And I think we as feminists need to reconceptualize that and really go back to looking at what it is that's happening in communities. Now, at the level of the macro and the meta level, we have many different policies. We have the donut economy, we have solidarity economy, social economy, a whole host of different types of economies. And yes, we need to engage with that because our policymakers are stunted, right? They're still beholden to the IMF, World Bank, macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, for most part, at least monetary part of it, is defunct. They're still using the same policy they used in the financial crisis now. What carries them is that their currencies are, the US is able to print money ad hoc, so is the EU, so are all the rest. Our currency are relatively not valuable compared to that. So we are stuck, we are borrowing, we go back to the IMF, and that gives these entities more powers, again, over our economies. So I think we need to really reconceptualize and rethink the development models that we have in light of climate change, but in light of COVID. And COVID is just one. If you read any of the future analysis that are put out by any of the military establishment, they'll tell you that there's a host of these pandemics waiting to attack us. And they can attack us, and they're smart, but also they can survive because our public health system is impoverished and pauperized. Our people, many of them don't have enough caloric and nutritional intake to be able to withstand some of this. And in terms of responding to an aggressive economic downfall, many don't have savings. Most all of them do not have savings or income or computers. So we're talking about going to school via online. And our ministers of education are spouting things about education online when 90% of our pupils don't have access to online. They don't have, even if you gave them computer, their homes are not wired. So we're looking also, we had in the 1980s, the debt crisis, a lost generation in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. After COVID, we'll have another set of lost generation, unless we're able to get our governments to rethink how they're doing things. I give the exact, we do not have leaders out anymore that are visionary creative. They're technocratic, and they're watching always to see what the market will do, what the IMF will do, and so forth. But I think there have been some issues, some areas. I see, for example, Mia Motley in Barbados has actually instead of relying on the company taxes, she's put up a fund to make sure that the poor people have money, and she's charged the corporate elites and all of those to put money in that fund, right? So that the people who are dispossessed, the people who don't have access to employment, insurance, or all this other kind of courage can have access. And it's that kind of thinking, when you think from the perspective of securing the base, not securing capital, because capital, these firms have amassed tremendous amount of money in their bursaries over the last 10 years since the financial crisis, in fact. So when we start making the policy, and the policy is about protecting them and helping to build back, and not looking at it from the perspective of essential workers, of people on the ground, we are rebuilding. So I'm very nervous about this idea of building back better. Building back better what? Building back what? Is that really what we want to do? Do we want to build back our global value chains to have our people slave for international capital? Or do we want to think of how ways that we can diversify our economy, rejig our economy, have our statistical system, re-look at what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and what we're calling it. And I know that it's difficult for individual countries, but we have now a lot of regional coordination. But the regional coordinations are themselves being supported by regional development banks who have thinking of technocrats coming out of the very institutions that we are critiquing. So we have to find ways to subvert some of these institutional processes and to ground again economics back to what it was, looking at what the household economy is doing and then building up. And so the building should be from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariama. And I mean, this is segues into yet another important narrative around languaging. So I'll take it in the reverse. I mean, building back better. I think for the last few months, a few of us have been talking about rather build forward radically, because what are we building back? Are we reinvigorating and reconstructing global capital, which is exactly where we have, why we are in the situation where healthcare systems have been fragmented and allowed to go to pieces since structural adjustment. And bearing in mind that structural adjustment, I'd like to pose the question to both of you is, did it really ever end, or has it just been reformed, renamed? And, you know, as the president said at the first Bandung Conference, perhaps it has continued to be readjusted in terms of languaging, but certainly not in its intent. And certainly the forms of unfreedom that you talk about, Mariama, you know, the different forms of unfreedom that have not really changed, but they have begun to be identified differently. So what used to be basic good old-fashioned imperialism, patriarchy, patriarchal states, the slavery, colonialism, when we see this reinvented time after time, as you rightly say, intellectually, politically, economically, and so forth, and the guises and the forms keep changing, but the impact is exactly the same. Certainly as well, that perhaps there's something to be said around the whole intersectional analysis that Bandung has offered us, that you speak to, Mariama, around race and decolonization. And I think that as well, the reclassification of measurements. So GDP is also failing us quite badly. Again, there's a few people who are interested in donut economics, people like Catherine Trebek, who I work with, well-being economics, solidarity economics, and I think also alluding to Devaki Jain's point, the no growth or the degrowth movement. What this actually means, particularly if we're going to think around remeasuring the way women's work is calculated, rethinking the way that women's work or the work that women do is calculated. Because of course, this segmentation, as you rightly say, this false dichotomy between the work of the home and the work in the marketplace, it's always been a false dichotomy. And what the coronavirus has helpfully done is to show what a false dichotomy it has been. This false dichotomy, to go back to Devaki's point, between the formal and the informal, or what, you know, I've been calling the parallel economy. And I think I love the first sector for some time. I'd like to point this back to you, Devaki, if I may, around something that you said around the term the third world. and I say this because I belong to a generation of women who were actually inspired by the notion that the third world is a liberatory phrase, because it actually is a reclamation away from any connection between either the East, which was the former Soviet Union, and the West, which was primarily the US and a few satellites across Europe. And that is the context in which I grew up understanding when I studied sociology when I was 16. That's the context in which we were told that the third world meant another world, other worlds, the worlds of the global South. And I'd be very interested and fascinated, perhaps if you would levitate on that, perhaps more for us.
But I would like to say something at this. Can I respond to Mariama? Can I respond to Mariama?
Yes, please do.
Mariama, you've given a huge menu to handle. And this is, if I may be critical of you, so this is a well-known thing. All the economic ways in which our countries are being enslaved has been recorded, and you give a very wide range of what is happening. But let's go back for a minute to the South Commission, and let us go back for a minute to Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. When it is not as if we didn't know this was happening, but he was making some very interesting proposals, which I want to put to the young feminists of Africa who are trying to reconstruct the world. He was asking countries like continents like Asia and Africa to say, look, you will get a better deal if you buy this from Germany, because they have very good, what shall I say, productivity. But make an effort, sacrifice yourself, buy from a neighboring South continent. He was asking for a moral underlining for how we reach our economies. Because whatever it is, capital moves with profit, and you cannot stop that. So if you have a moral underpinning, and why I wrote that my opening remarks for the current attempt by feminists in Africa to reinvent NAM and Bandung and all that is, partnership means you swallow some of the normal corporate, normal economic, and do something which is a bit sacrificing, but it is to create solidarity. Mwalimu had a very interesting example. He said, okay, Tanzania wants to buy trucks. The trucks are cheaper from Germany, but she'll buy from India, even though it is 40% costlier. South-South solidarity economics also requires, Mariama, a shifting from what is the economic theory which is behind all this. So while you give a very wide range of experiences and interest in economics, I think what I would love it if these young women who have got together for a reinventing of Bandung is to create an economic program where there is sacrifice of each other's commercial interests. But the idea would be to put down on the floor a full employment program, which means you will not get World Bank support, you will not get IMF support, but you have to do it as a moral imperative. Now take Sylvia Tamale's book. When she argues for a total different political economy and language, she brought out Ubuntu and said, this is Africa. Let's go back to Ubuntu. What is Ubuntu? Sharing. Sharing so much that you have to make sacrifices for profit of who you buy from. I think some brilliant underpinning ethic is necessary if you want to overcome all the various issues that Mariama raised. That's a big package which we've been trying to deal with. Even when as a South Commission, we tried to deal with the same package: mineral extraction, foreigners coming in, capital being taken away. But there has to be, here we have today, this particular gathering that has come is to reinvent Bandung, which means solidarity between ex-colonies and finding a solidarity in economics. And I think you can be of great support if you can give us an economic platform which does throw away all these other possible disasters that have taken place. You take Liberia, they have full of street vendors. When I went to Liberia, the economy was being held up by what we call the higglers, or the women on the streets. In fact, I went to see the governor of the Reserve Bank of Liberia because I was asked to write a plan for Liberia. And he said to me, ma'am, you know where the bank is? On the streets. My bank cellar is empty. The cash is with them. But then when the new president came, and she's one of us, she invited the Chinese to come and do mining. So that whole idea of the street vendors holding up the economy was replaced by a traditional form of economic growth. So if my hope and my dream is that this group that has been formed, for which we have been invited, throws away some of these kinds of economic programs and ideas and makes the sacrifice of saying we want a new type of economics, even if it takes us away from the global trend in economics. It's possible. It's just that you have to turn the screw in a different way. I was really disappointed when Liberia moved away from the higglers to inviting the Chinese to mine. So, you know what happens when that happens. So I want Mariama to, I'm not today, but we are friends and we'll talk again, Mariama and I would like to change her mind on the program. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you,
What
Devaki. Thank you
Pheko?
very much. Yeah, I mean, the notion of solidarity between states and what global southern solidarity means seems to resonate particularly with the Bandung project, but also in an era when it has become so perverted. So you have the BRICS, which to me are no ideological relative of Bandung or even non-alignment, but rather a reproduction of corporatist styles of, corporatist, capitalist and market orthodox forms of doing states and of actually reproducing power that is already quite toxic power. So it's more a case of expanding the table of colonial economic interests rather than the multipolar world that we would have hoped for, right? We would have hoped that if the Black, brown people involved, it would in fact be something that's a bit more meaningful and that bears more resonance to the Mwalimos. But in fact, it begs the question, is capitalism better if it's got a tan, if it's Black or brown? Of course it's not, it's just as toxic. And perhaps in responding to this briefly, Mariama, what would you think might be some of the ways forward can we claim back, can we rehabilitate the WTO? I mean, can we rehabilitate non-alignment in the way that it's been re-engineered over the last 10 or 20 years? Is it possible for some of these and kind of South-South solidarity that Devaki is calling for? Where are the places that this can happen when even some of our own institutions, the African Union, are also captured spaces to a great extent? They're disappointingly captured or disappointingly weak and unideological and deeply corporatized and compromised. Mariama? You're still on mute, Mariama.
We can hear you.
I said, yes, sorry. It's a good question, a big question. Because we no longer have leadership at any of our governmental level that is visionary. They're all technocratic. They all are moving forward and looking back, and they're looking back at what Europe, Washington, and most importantly, what the capital markets are thinking, are saying. And very few of them are looking to see what are really the keystone for the economy. And that's what we need. And I think we need to begin to build from the bottom up, right? There are a host of people working at the macro level. As I said, there are people from many of the schools that are recognized by our governments who are articulating ideas that we have talked about for many years on the ground. Donut economics, well-being economics, a lot of that comes from solidarity economy, come from the ground. They've been real packaged nicely, and that's great, and I'm glad that. So that's one level of work. But at the same time, none of our governments are in any way attracted to those ideas. They want quick capital gain, which is why they always for foreign direct investment. They want quick money. They want to see quick turnaround for their election cycles. So the only longevity we have are the people on the ground the people in trade unions, the people who are working at the level of agriculture and forest. So we need to build those. And that means we need to get out from where we are in academia in many places and start shoring up those economies. And there are multiple economies operating in each of our countries. There's not just one, there are multiple economies, and we need to interlink those economies, whatever the principle is, whether it's solidarity, sharing, or gift, right? I think that's one of the opportunities that COVID has allowed us to be able to visualize and to see and to value what is going on the ground level, on the street level. At the meta and more meso level, it's the organizing that we are doing, right? That you are doing together, the thinking, the bringing together some analysis that actually tries to put in context what's happening on the ground, linking it to the policies at the macro level and where those policies need to change to be reshaped so that they can actually support what are the base of the economy. I don't see, at this juncture, I don't see many of our governments being willing to shift the path, because even if they're in power, they're looking for, our finance ministers are looking for IMF, World Bank approval. Our ministers of agriculture are looking for big multinationals who are doing value chain. And so what we've seen, and I think that what COVID has shown a lot of things, right? COVID has shown that this acceptance of global value chain as the basis for a new development model is at best shaky and at worst destructive. As the first sign of external shock in the global market, value chains go under. And we're going to see quite a lot of them. Either they're going to push us to reduce our wages to the absolute minimum, or they're going to revert back home or to nearer places. So they're at this point also rethinking the value chain, the supply chain. And it's only for countries like South Korea who have a system that's quickly flexible and adaptable, who can overnight literally retune their infrastructure to be able to produce vaccines and to other kinds of things, who will be making it. The rest of us, we thought global value chain was a savior, so we did not invest.
But Mariama, if I may interrupt, this is the reality. I mean, remember when we failed as a South Commission for the same reason. You give ideas, but the economics and the entrepreneurs simply don't want to go into that kind of mode. Mm-hmm. So we have the same wall against doing anything which is economic justice. But here we have these young feminists who are meeting with kind of new ideas of wanting to do a new Bandung. What do they mean by that? A new kind of solidarity. Now, people like you and me, what we can give is ideas with which they can build that new solidarity, even if it looks unrealistic. If we always go by realism, we will never remove inequality and poverty in the world, because the power of capitalism and the power of corporate and the economists who believe in that kind of economics, it dominates us. I mean, it's impossible. You know what's happened to all our countries. We are enslaved by that particular economic theorem. But the challenge is now coming, and the reason I accepted coming to this gathering is there's some kind of spirit here saying, and you read Sylvia Tamale and others, they want to break down this whole system which we are fighting against. Now, that may be unrealistic, Mariama, but you and I as economists can at least give the idea which they could be tried, even if it fails. Some idea has to be tried now. If we
that's why I'm saying you have to work at the bottom. You cannot do it. You're not going to change it in academia or even where I'm sitting. You have to go out and help to build people's lives and help them to sustain their life, because they have to be able to sustain, or else they too will be, you see what happened in the US when people aren't getting their needs best. They're easily grabbed by fanatical fascist ideas. Unless you stabilize the economy and go into support, and that's through solidarity, that's putting our money that we might be earning in corporations or in think tank, putting those money into in institutions at the local level, that operates at the local level, that can get the woman water, get them food, get them everything, and help to build that capacity. You're not going to move. And I don't think any amount of theorizing is going to move it, because we've been doing that. All of these ideas.
Give that as a message to them, that this is where you have to start. And I think the interest in bringing back another kind of solidarity between the former colonies is to stop us from getting into the trap that we have got into. We are entrapped. I mean, look at India, completely enslaved by the current macroeconomic theory. And you know that sitting in the South Commission, that all you can do is to write about some possibilities, but you can't shift the macroeconomic power that is now holding us. So I know that I'm arguing, but I'm arguing because we are here because of this extraordinary initiative that these young women have taken, building a new Bandung. I mean, it's a fantastic idea.
Well,
So
and
that
we haven't even talked about the fact that we have an existential threat of climate change, which will make all this discussion mute if we're not able to actually, for many of us in smaller islands and other coastal cities, if we're not able to do that. But how long have we been working on these ideas, and where are we got to?
Can I intervene briefly? I think this is, I think for a lot of us, this is a rare treat to listen to our big sisters and our elders really going at it, because in ways that are rigorous and challenge not only, they're not only challenging each other, but challenge us in our thinking, particularly because these are roads well walked by both of you for a long time. I know, Mariama, we've been walking the WTO streets for a long time. And I know, Devaki, that you have been walking the streets post-Bandung for a very, very long time. And I'd like to ask a question in that light as well, whether or not what is the kind of architecture that we need then to reframe the sort of global relations that have become very toxic, very masculinized, that are about not narrow nationalism. So Donald Trump is not the only Trumpist. There are many Trump. The guy from Brazil, he's a Trumpist. There are many Trumpists. Boris Johnson is a Trumpist. Emmanuel Macron is a Trumpist. You can call them different things, but there are many Trumpists across the world. We could possibly argue that Moody is a Trumpist as well. So even in the global South, there are problematic leaders, mostly men. I was going to say stupid men, but that's not fair. But very unenlightened people who are not helping us to move forward. And in terms of the languaging that we need to move these sorts of institutions and these processes forward, Mariama, you say ground up, rightly so. Devaki, you are about very rigorous evidence-based research, rightly so. But how do we then reconstruct a feminist identity and imagination? Sort of anchors like well-being economics, solidarity economics, which I think have actually come from feminism to a great extent. Feminism and feminist political economy has given the world new definitions around growth. It's feminist economics which has helped the world to see that GDP does not work as a measure of prosperity, as a measure of well-being for the broad community. What do we need to do? And I'll point that to you first, Devaki, if I may.
you asked me to speak first, or Mariama?
Yes, please. You, please, Professor Jain.
Okay. There is, while I see what Mariama is saying, she's asking me to be realistic. And I think I submit to that. But we have been realistic. The world is trapped in inequality. My God, the inequality. And the inequality is creating pressures on anyone who tries to rebuild from below. You can't do that. So most countries are trapped in that, and they've not been able to move out of it because the macroeconomic paradigm and the theories that back it are not in favor of letting go and letting people rise up and do all that stuff. So we have a number of conflict states, we have dictatorships coming, we have military rule coming, because you are oppressing the masses who are not satisfied. So that scenario is a realistic one, and I respect Mariama for saying, don't be a fool, don't be unrealistic, that's the reality. But I'm shifting my theories and arguments to respond to this current conference that you called. One has to speak to that particular thing. Now, that particular thing, as I see it, the South Feminist Futures Conference, pushed forward by an idea of revitalizing South-South. All the people know that there's a South Commission, that there was a South Center, that we failed also to get our act together, the theories can't be changed. But in spite of that, said revitalizing a new Bandung. Now, I want to respect that hope. And if you have a hope and an ideal that you can in fact change and build it from, you take any of the stories that they've written, whether Sylvia Tamale on feminism or others on how economies can be rebuilt from the street vendors and not from capitalists. It's our ideas. Now, ideas need backup by mass support. An idea doesn't walk on its own. So mass support could be a women's movement, it could be our networks, it could be a group of South African nations deciding to follow a new path. These are all possibilities. So we can put those possibilities on the agenda. Otherwise, we'll always be crushed by the reality. The reality is you can't do that. That's how it is. So though at this point you may say, my God, this old woman is still having hope. It's because of this particular initiative to which I've been invited, where you are there, Pheko. That initiative gave me a feeling that, okay, these children are trying to look back at Bandung, which was a dream, and saying we'll revive the spirit of Bandung, which is solidarity by leaders. And that solidarity to change the economics. Now, to do economics, you have to have a bonding amongst the political leaders. And Mariama is right. They all want to follow what Bank says. Nobody wants to follow something that Gandhi or Nyerere may have said. But the feminist movement wants to say, we will take power and we'll do it. So why don't we give them some ideas on how that can be done? Because otherwise the package or constraints that Mariama talked about are insurmountable. That is going to be forever till all. They are there. We know that as very well. South Commission has tried to write papers to show how South-South solidarity can help. All they are able to do is to go to UN and talk of the South's voice. But they can't stop the corporates from going to wherever they go to have cheap garments made and things like that. So that's why I was trying to provoke and say, yes, possible, let's try. And that's the only way we can move forward, in my opinion. You must think of an economics just like Sylvia Tamale has thought of a new feminism, which can be put on the ground by mobilizing opinion around it. Mobilizing women's opinion and maybe some of the African structures like SADC and the ones that you have.
Thank you so much.
We are old friends.
Yeah, mobilizing ideas, mobilizing opinions, because as you both rightly say, ideas don't just walk. They need us to give them life as well. I'd like to sort of turn to some of the couple of questions or statements. Olivia Hartigan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, how do you feel about the term Global South in relation to the imperialism of vocabulary? Is this colonial language? And I'd like to piggyback on that and re-present and resubmit the question that I asked earlier around Global South versus Third World as a term and so forth. And I'll ask you to take a bite at that first, Devaki, since it was a point that you raised, and Mariama, you can also weigh in. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, right a long time ago, actually, even in the 70s and 80s, when the international women's movement started to mobilize itself, meet in Geneva, meet here, and I was lucky to be one of those. We have always had some trouble with terminology, this idea of how we define ourselves, how we are described. For example, the underdevelopment changed into developing. And I remember when we were invited to a conference and they said, you are a group from the underdeveloped countries. We said, no, we are from the South. That is to shift the language to say that we are not underdeveloped, or to say we are the ex-colonies. So you change the language, you change who you are. So there is a possibility there for us to move forward with language also. That's why I spent some time on vocabulary. Our vocabularies are against us. So that's why we changed from underdeveloped countries to developing countries. And then we now say we are South economies, shifting the stigma of underdevelopment. So there are many tricks by which you create dignity for yourself And one should create dignity and say, I'm empowering myself, I'm not underdeveloped, I'm not a colony. I have an identity which is agriculture, or my leader is Nyerere, he's transformed Tanzania. And then we move forward so that we get some mileage in us, in our ego. I mean, again, I'm coming back to this particular group that has been set up. I was inspired by the fact that they want to do something which is so unrealistic in a way, and yet idealistic. And so if you can't follow such ideas and say, we are the new Bandung, that is solidarity, and then Bandung also had an economic program. That's the idealism that one needs to support with some kind of economic arguments, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mariama.
Let me just say a couple of things. One is, I don't think that, I'm not sure that in any of my remarks I've ever said that it's foolish to dream or to hope. That's why we do this work, and that's why we're still doing the work, or else we'll be somewhere else. But we always start from the position of what history tells us. And sometimes we have to rethink the history, rewrite the history, because it's not written for us. But we have to be mindful of that. And in the context of Bandung, let's be very clear that Bandung was really good for having the spirit of solidarity. But by 1960, that solidarity had petered out, right?
Absolutely.
And they didn't leave Bandung with an official program of action. They left with a communique and a declaration. And I think that's how you start, because despite that, it managed to generate, as I said before, many Southern institutions and set the basis for South-South cooperation, where those 10 principles of Bandung communique still live in our government, though some of them are implemented in very pale or lightly ways. So first, that's important. I think that feminist economists and radical feminist economists, and especially Southern feminist economists, who have been looking at structural injustice, global structural injustice, and development pathways that are not working, and the way that structural adjustment has morphed into stabilization. Now we're morphing to other kinds of things. And all of the results ends up the same way, with our countries indebted and participating in different financialization and exploitation of nature. And many of us, even those in the Caribbean, who talk a lot about existential threat, our governments are still giving contracts to big corporates to build hotels on beaches. We're still very happy to find oil and to exploit those oil with the same big corporations that in the climate negotiations we're making rules against. So the contradiction abounds, okay? So we continue nonetheless. And I think that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a tremendous amount of ideas about how you can reconceptualize the economy. And some of those come from the ground. The solidarity economy certainly comes from what people have been doing on the ground in Latin America and certain communities in Africa and Asia. And people on the ground are living their lives. They're not waiting for us to come to rescue them, which is why I say we need to go in and work with them and build our communities and ring fence and solidify those communities. And since we're analytically bent, we draw out lessons from those. We try to codify them, to systematize them, and link up with some of the other academically advanced notions, whether it's well-being economic, whether it's donut economics, all of those exist. And so we as Southern feminists need to interrogate those, own what we can, claim what we can, but always we have to start from the perspective of those who are working on the ground. Now, we've seen many networks like WeGo have tremendous amount of influence by going and organizing people who are so-called in the informal economy. So yes, it can be done. What I'm saying is that we're not going to overthrow the system from academia or from the think tank of South Center, others. We have to link up with our brothers and sisters on the ground and have a top-down, bottom-up process. And we have to be mindful that COVID is not the only thing. It's dramatic because it stopped capital cold in many levels, except for the fact that they're living off the government handout. But there's climate change, and there is building adaptation and resilience for people who are suffering and who are going to be ongoing suffering daily from these kinds of impacts. And so our energies has to be working with those who are working on the ground, whether it's trade union, whether it's my MSME alliances, whether it's farmers group, farmers cooperative, all of those. We need to build them, solidify them also, so that they can also push their governments, our governments, to make those changes that are necessary. Without that, we're not going to move forward, because our governments are beholden to international capital, and international capital is not going to give us anything unless we push and push at the interests, try to create the cracks and the fissures and push our government headlong through them. That's how I see this playing out.
And I think that sort of links quite well. Thanks, Mariama. I think that links also well with a comment which I see here, which I think it's important to ventilate, by Hibist Casa, who says the crisis we are facing is crippling trade unions, for instance, in a manner that is forcing them to reimagine themselves to remain relevant. And I mean, we saw what's happened across Europe with trade unionism, but what's happening across many countries. I was unfortunate enough to be growing up under Margaret Thatcher when she was taking her sword to informal economy and the world of work. Smallholder producers are themselves also facing threats. I think that also speaks to what you both spoke about regarding the deficits of global value chains as well, through the rubble of economic decline. So yes, mutual aid, that rebuilding these links from below is an organizing and an intellectual activity. Yes, this is international, and the ecological crisis itself as an existential crisis, to coin a term again, that amplifying, and I think that's a very helpful segue to much of what has already been said, right? I think in our final few moments, I'd like to point this out again. I think we're both, or most of us are quite mesmerized, and I'm suspecting that that's probably why there are not too many questions coming. We're both here. Yeah, somebody says it's wonderful to hear our feminist elders embracing hope in a challenging and depressing context, exactly. And going back to basics to build from the streets. And I think that most of us are feeling both inspired and challenged by so much of what has been said, because there's nothing that's new under the sun, right? There's nothing that hasn't been happening before. And I think that we should really continue to think around the importance of South-South cooperation, as you both rightly say, and what internationalism means in this current moment, and not the internationalism which is underpinned by corporatist interests, but the internationalism which is linked, which is anchored in Devaki's very truism around sacrificial, sacrificing not only national boundaries, by the way, and national interest, but really it's sacrificing the short term in return for a long-termism, long-term skills sharing, long-term value chain addition across sectors and regions. And I think finally, it would also be useful to also bear in mind what would a South-South internationalist project look like from a feminist that the South Futures experiment is going to become, right? Which is transnational, that is translinear, that goes beyond a really colonial imagination that appreciates that most of the world is non-white. So it's not about a few people, Black and brown people, coming together and huddling. It's actually the fact that we are at the center of global power, the center of global productivity, global economics. As you both have said, we are the ones who produce, who sustain the rest of the world. Without Black, brown women, there is no world, there is no planet, whether ecologically, whether in terms of production, skills, there is no world. And it would be, I would encourage us to really rethink and reframe and reimagine ourselves, not as peripheral beings, but as central beings. And finally, the whole notion of the the historical ways in which we have had to maintain ourselves, maintain well-being, not only as an economic imperative, but as a social imperative, a mental, educational imperative as well. I'd like to sort of like give a few remarks, give you both maybe a couple minutes to close off our remarks before we close this session. And again, I'll start with, this time I'll start with Devaki Jain again.
You want to hear that me again? Did you say you want me to say something? I couldn't understand.
Would you like to nations? Please go ahead. Devaki?
Oh,
can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm very happy that I had this debate with Mariama, because that is an important perspective. And I think that is the perspective that we have to keep in mind when we try these, looks like crazy ways in which we can bring the house down. You know, it's like, I want to bring the house down and you can't bring it down. But I like this initiative that has been taken by the feminists here. I want to see how we can make it flourish. And the hope I have is that in Africa as a continent, and I asked Mariama to guide me if I'm wrong, amongst the continents of the South, that is Latin America, Asia, and Africa, forget China and East Asia. I think Africa is doing much better than us, for example. You're doing better than South Asia. Partly because in some sense, your leaders and your unions, that is the African Union, SADC, others, are working towards creating strength, political power, which they didn't have, and they were overrun in the early days by IMF, World Bank. So there seems to be a life here, and I think much of it is supported by the women's movement, whether I hear Gracia Machel or I hear any other. Everybody is talking about the fact that many, many women in Africa are holding positions. Gracia said 50 scientific institutions are headed by women. So many of your states have prime ministers and presidents who are women. So there's a huge women-led African continent, much more than Asia, much more than Latin America, and much more than Europe. So when you have a women-led continent, I meant much more in percentage or proportion than other continents, and you think that they have some idea of bringing in more people into justice, into economic well-being, through this kind of ideas that are being thrown out by your group here, then perhaps it might work. It certainly won't work in India. We have just decided that we are a capitalist economy, and we will continue to do that. And when we had the pandemic, we pampered the capitalists and we just left the workers absolutely in the ditch, which they are still climbing, not able to climb out of. There was no doubt who we cared for. But it is possible that in Africa, you did not quite do that, I'm not sure. But therefore, one wants to make Africa shine because it has the potential. But right now, South Asia is in the dumps. So one sees it getting more and more crushed by both capitalism and the sense of a government which is not open to other voices. And let me put it mildly like that. But I want to just share with you that I'm so happy that Mariama is in South Center. Now, South Commission was built on the idea that South would bond with each other and we would do something which would resist the North's economic power. It was supposed to be the response to Willy Brandt's program. And at OECD, we were to have South Center. That is, at that point, it was hoped that the South countries would form an economic club like OECD, and that would be the transaction. But we did not form the OECD. We did not form a similar thing, that dark OECD, the economic club that Europe became. And now, of course, they're dismantling it with whatever is happening. But we couldn't do that because our countries are not willing to make that kind of change in economic program, as well as have the idealism to do what they did in Europe. I wonder whether Mariama agrees with that or not, because she's right there in the heart of all this. And I'm watching it from outside.
So Mariama, in your last final comments, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I don't have facts and data to make a distinction, a judgment about whether or not Africa is doing better than South Asia or Southeast Asia, because I haven't actually asked that question. I look at Africa in terms of what's going on in terms of different area. We know we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, but at the same time, the very same Africa is also negotiating with the EU an EPA agreement that will also impact the functionality and the success of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So all our governments are bounded. I don't see that there are any, that whether they're female-led or not, you have female-led, and I have an issue, and it's an issue that we've been discussing in many questions about this idea of numbers. Because if the female-led are not gender sensitive and willing to expose and lead from the gender knowledge and gender information, because they're getting the same information from the old playbook as others, then the numbers by themselves are not so meaningful. It is what are they doing? And I haven't explored any of that to see what these women who are in these governments or scientific community are doing that is dramatically different in terms of outcome from their male counterparts. Great that they're there, kudos. I think Africa and Asia have been doing quite a good work in terms of engendering, using the word engendering political institutions and power. But the power dynamic still doesn't change. So we have a lot of work to do. I think that we go through this cycle where different regions are doing well. We go through a period where Latin America is up, the Caribbean is down, Caribbean up, Asia is down, Southeast Asia is up, South Asia is down. So we have this cyclical thing that moves. And it moves based on what's going on in terms of capital movement, in terms of leadership, in terms of commitment, in terms of a whole host of things. So we just have to wait and see. It's great. I think Rwanda and a lot of other African countries have been doing really good growth-wise. And then the question is that growth going into the rural community? Is it going, are we still, because we're still using the metrics of GDP, and we're still using all the other metrics. So on the reality on the ground, is it substantially changing the lives of the men and women in the villages, the far reaches from the capitals? So I think those are things that I would need to look at to make those judgments. With regard to the South Center, I think the South Center has never been incapacitated the way that the South had thought it would be. We're nowhere near to being the OECD. And in fact, the OECD now has a developing country wing, and it's now recruiting the very same developing countries who were meant to be members of the South Center, who would not pay the South Centers, but are now paying an even bigger fee to join the OECD. So, we have all that. And the South Center itself, depending on the leadership at different times, play the role or not play the role. And the institution itself is having challenges at the moment. And actually, this is my last month at the South Center, Devaki. So I leave at the end of this month. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Mariama. Thank you so much, Devaki Jain as well. Thank you so much to everybody who's here. I think it's been a privilege and a treat to listen to, I think, feminist elders and who we don't hear from often enough, particularly yourself, Professor Jain. It has been a real treat to engage, and we appreciate both of your generosity and your willingness to be with us in the trenches and to try something new. And thank you particularly, Devaki, for calling us young women. We appreciate that very much. And because we are children of struggle to a great extent as well. And I think that we also would like to always remember that these things, there's nothing new under the sun. There's this book, which I was in preparation for this I dug up. I don't know if it's visible, but the title is about women's powers and wisdoms, debates on political restructuring and social transformation, which was published by Dawn many, many years ago. This is a 1999 or 2000 with Repem years ago. So these debates have been taking place and they continue to. We thank you because you are the giants on whose shoulders we stand and we pivot from. And I think in saying that, I'd like to appreciate the translators, appreciate all of the co-organizers, the midwives of this process, the people who have been giving us the backroom support in all of this regard. And I wish everybody here a feminist future that is filled with fire, with hope, with optimism, and the assurance of victory.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've been wonderful.
Yes, it's been great. Thank you, Devaki. See you. Bye-bye.
Mariama, you lots of love.
All right, good. Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
And I'd also like to encourage for the people who are still on the call to go to engage with our website for further events that are taking place over the next 5 days. This is an ongoing festival of brilliance, of hope, of optimism, and of audacity. So please go to our website and have a look out for those events, southfeministfuturesfestival.org. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you.